So, long-time listeners might remember a while back on the show, we covered the New York Police Department's racist and unconstitutional spying on Muslim Americans. Many of you, if you aren't longtime listeners, you might have heard this story too. It was a long-form, in-depth investigation from the Associated Press. Really phenomenal reporting. It won a Pulitzer Prize. If you don't remember or you haven't heard the story before, here's the gist in a nutshell. So the NYPD sent out undercover agents into mosques where they monitored sermons. They went to, mosques the inside when they were having meetings and community meetings. They did all this without any proof of wrongdoing or criminality at all. They spied on mosques. They spied on restaurants. They spied on student groups. They spied on political groups. They spied on and mapped out entire Muslim neighborhoods, not just in New York City, but also in New York State and surrounding states. They spied on student groups at Yale in Connecticut. They spied on student groups in Pennsylvania. They spied on student groups in Rutgers in New Jersey. And again, we are talking about a little thing about this here. We are talking about a city police force. They did get some help from the CIA, but again, this is a city police force who spied on other states. And not only that, they spied on entire neighborhoods and communities, again, based solely upon their religion, the Muslim religion. Clearly something that is blatantly unconstitutional here. So one of the groups that they spied on that was revealed in the story was a group of Muslims in New Jersey, and they sued the NYPD. Well, late last week, I regret to report that a U.S. District Court judge, a man named Justice William J. Martini, dismissed the case and threw it out. Now, that's negative news. That's bad news on its own. But how the judge actually dismissed the case, how he did it, it's actually even more infuriating and even more frightening when you actually look into this, that this guy's a judge. So, reading from Justice Martini's ruling, quote, "Plaintiffs must plead sufficient factual matter to show that the city adopted and implemented the surveillance program not for a neutral investigative reason, but for the purpose of discriminating on account of religion. The plaintiffs in this case have not alleged facts from which it can plausibly be inferred that they were targeted solely because of their religion. The more likely explanation for the surveillance was a desire to locate budding terrorist conspiracies. The most obvious reason for so conducting is that the surveillance of Muslim community began just after the attacks of September 11th. The police could not have monitored New Jersey Muslim terrorist activities without monitoring the Muslim community itself." End quote. So, he's saying, well, we can't spy on all the Muslims unless you let us spy on all the Muslims. Sure, we have no evidence of any wrongdoing or any crime, but they're Muslims, so spy away, NYPD. He essentially said, sure, they're being targeted entirely because of their religion, but some Muslims are terrorists, and therefore all Muslims can be spied upon. Because a certain member of a certain religion committed a certain crime, all members of that religion are therefore subject to surveillance and infiltration. I don't know if Justice Martini is aware of this fact. I imagine all of you are, but I don't know if the judge is actually aware of this fact after reading a ruling like that. So, Justice Martini, are you aware that there's actually been Christian murderers in this country before? There's actually been a lot of Christian murderers in America. Does that mean that all Christian churches can be infiltrated and spied upon and have their sermons recorded? That all church groups should be spied upon and infiltrated? Look, clearly, this Islamophobic judge is scared of Muslims and is perfectly fine with Muslims having their constitutional rights being violated. And that's horrible and it's frightening and hopefully it will be turned around on appeal, but it's clearly something that's unconstitutional. This crazy ass judge felt otherwise. But what actually comes next in the judge's ruling is actually frightening on a different level. So he doesn't think that the NYPD did any wrong or any harm in their blanket spying on all Muslim Americans. That's fine. Spying on all the Muslim Americans is perfectly fine, NYPD. He doesn't think the NYPD did any wrong or is to blame at all, but this Judge Martini, thinks that someone is to blame, and that someone caused some harm. Guess who he thinks that is? Reading from his ruling again, quote, "None of the plaintiff's injuries arose until after the Associated Press released unredacted, confidential NYPD documents and articles expressing its own interpretation of those documents. Nowhere in the complaint do plaintiffs allege that they suffered harm prior to the unauthorized release of the documents by the Associated Press. This confirms that plaintiffs' alleged injuries flow from the Associated Press's unauthorized disclosure of the documents. The harms are not fairly traceable to any act of surveillance." End quote. He really wrote that. He really said that. This is a U.S. judge. So it's not the illegal, unconstitutional spying that did the harm. Oh no, it's the reporting of the illegal, unconstitutional spying that did the harm. So really, Muslim Americans, you should be suing the Associated Press for letting you know that the NYPD had infiltrated your mosque and is spying upon you. He actually wrote that. A U.S. district judge actually wrote that in a ruling, in a court. He blamed the press for exposing a clear violation of the Constitution. That the exposure of the corruption, that the exposure of inherent Islamophobia by the NYPD, that did the harm. The exposure did the harm, not the Islamophobia itself, not the unconstitutional spying itself, but the exposure and the reporting on it. Sounds sort of familiar when we talk about the NSA, stuff like that. You know, the MSNBC reports, they have a report on this as well. Bahir Azmi from the Center for Constitutional Rights said of the ruling, quote, "The opinion as similarly written justifies wholesale discrimination against Muslims for no other reason than their religion without any limits whatsoever. It sanctions the widest form of racial profiling that I've seen in a district court opinion in a long time." End quote. And it does. It absolutely does. It clearly does. And if you think that this type of blatant discrimination doesn't have actual consequences, actual human consequences. If you think, oh, it's no big deal. If they're not doing anything wrong, why should they care? You know, I'm not doing anything wrong. They shouldn't care if they're spied upon unless they're not doing anything wrong. Am I right? If you think this has no human consequences on these poor people, you're wrong. Kevin Gostola over at Firedog Lake actually writes that one of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit, a man named Saeed Hassan, who, by the way, is a United States soldier who served in Iraq for the United States military, who is a member of a mosque in New Jersey. Gostola writes, quote, "Hassan alleged that he had, quote, decreased his mosque attendance significantly since learning that the mosque he attends had been under surveillance by the NYPD because of the reasonable, well-founded fear that his security clearance would be jeopardized by being closely affiliated with mosques under surveillance by enforcement." End quote. So here we have a Muslim American soldier who is a member of our United States military. He has a reasonable fear that if he practices his religion, his career in the military might be jeopardized. Not only that, the Muslim American Civil Liberties Coalition, along with some other groups, released a report last year that found that the spying had unbelievably high consequences on Muslim American communities. Reading again from Firedog Lake, new individuals in the community who did not immediately appear to fit in are judged as possible agent provocateurs. A number of Muslims are choosing to pray at home instead of going to mosques. Muslim students choose to lay low and not engage in protest that might draw attention and more spying. Muslims in the community spaces feel pressure to censor their conversations. They are afraid to criticize surveillance because that might mean they're subject subjected to more government surveillance. These are real consequences here, folks. Real consequences having real and horrific effects on poor, innocent Americans' lives. Again, these are people, these are not criminals. There is no wrongdoing here. They are just being spied upon because they are Muslim. The spying is a clear violation of their constitutional rights. They're clear violation of their civil rights. And I'm sorry, the response of, but they're Muslims and there's some bad Muslims, that's not bloody good enough. That's not good enough. No matter what some crazy-ass Islamophobic judge says. The answer isn't less reporting on this type of horrific behavior in our society. It's more reporting and more lawsuits. We'll be right back.